Jo? Tak jo, pouštím.
Good afternoon, welcome everybody. This is the fifth seminar within our series Early Modern Metaphors of Knowledge, which is organized by the Department of Comenius Studies and Early Modern Intellectual History, Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences. Last time we discussed metaphors in the works of the era of humanism, the 15th century humanist Lorenzo Valla and the late humanist and famous astronomer Johannes Kepler. This time we will move further to the mid-17th century and late 17th century, and we will be discussing metaphors used by two authors, Henry Moore and Fontenelle, in his Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds. These are very different authors, of course, and very different genres of works which we will hear about and which we will discuss. Nevertheless, there are some links between these topics. Of course, both topics discuss broader field of natural philosophy and how various metaphors are used in the natural philosophical works and in discussion about natural philosophical topics. Another link, which is interesting, I believe, is that both authors, Henry Moore and Fontenelle, react to post-Cartesian developments. Both of them react to Cartesianism, to Descartes and his natural philosophy, broadly speaking, but in a very different ways, of course, and the genres are very different as well. Of course, as usually, each speaker has 20 minutes for the presentation, and we will have a discussion afterwards after both papers. I would like to ask now my colleague Petr Pavlas, who is together with Lenka Řezníková and myself, organizer of this seminar series. I would like to ask him chairing today's session. Okay, so let's begin, Petr.
Thank you, Vladimir. So it's my honor to introduce the first speaker of today's seminar, who is Jacques Joseph. Jacques Joseph is a researcher and lecturer at the Department of Philosophy and History of Science at the Faculty of Science of the Charles University in Prague, where he earned his PhD in 2018 with a dissertation thesis on Henry Moore. An adapted and extended version of his dissertation thesis is in print at the moment and is soon to be published as a monograph. His field of interest is not only Renaissance and early modern philosophy, but also current philosophy of science, especially French epistemology. He has published a Czech translation of Gaston Bachelard's Le Nouvel Esprit Scientifique, excuse my French, and other his essays. In general, Jacques Joseph investigates interactions between philosophy, science, and imagination as an original way of approaching the world. So please, Jacques, the screen is yours.
Thank you for this introduction. And yes, so let me just share my presentation. So yes, there won't be too much of Descartes in my presentation today, but if we want to talk more about this, we can do so in the discussion. What I would like to do in my presentation is examine one specific metaphor or image in the work of Henry Moore, and that is his use of light as a metaphor for the soul. Of course, this comparison or this similarity between the light and the soul is something that we can find in many authors all throughout the history of philosophy, and especially in the Platonic tradition. But I think that it is especially interesting to look on it in Henry Moore's works for two reasons. One I will just mention briefly, and again, we can go into more detail in the discussion. But this first reason is the fact that as opposed to other philosophers, like, for example, Marsilio Ficino or Francesco Patrizi, who both have been a big inspiration for Henry Moore, Henry Moore does not have what we might call metaphysics of light. And by this, I mean that he doesn't really have a philosophical theory that would somehow, on a metaphysical level, bind together light and soul or spiritual and immaterial entities, and thus justify this, this metaphor between the light and the soul. So this is the first interesting point in Henry Moore. And the second, which I will focus on in my presentation, is that Moore uses one and the same metaphor throughout his philosophical career to defend different philosophical accounts of the soul. But he still uses the same image for this. So just, yes. So just for a bit of context, usually Moore's works is divided into an early and a later period. The early period comprehends mostly his early Platonic poems, which means a series of poems that has been published first in 1642 and then in an expanded edition in 1647. And then there is what is considered his later works, which is basically everything that came afterwards, which is very different style because it's not poetry anymore. It's really just philosophical tracts, and even the philosophical ideas defended there are quite different. And this is, I would say, the trend in more scholarship is really to see these two periods as very much different and divided by a big gap. And this is something that we can find already in, or Henry Moore himself already sort of prepares the way for this understanding of his work. As we can see, for example, in the preface to his Opera Omnia, where he specifically says that whenever we find any discrepancy, we should correct his earlier views by what he writes in his later writings. And then he proceeds to present two specific examples of opinions that he originally accepted and later rejected. And the first of these opinions is actinism, which is just another word for the Neoplatonic emanation theory. And the second opinion that he mentions in this context is Hollenmerism, which is his, again, it's a neologism that Moore introduced that describes how souls relate to space. And it is basically the topic that I will be talking about today. So Hollenmerism is a term that Moore coined, and it's derived from the Greek words for holos and meros, so a whole and a part. And it is just a technical term to describe the, I might say, or I am tempted to say, traditional understanding that says that the soul is whole in the whole body and whole in each of its parts. As the classical Latin dictum, tota in toto corpore et tota in qualibet parte corporis. And so it's an answer to the question of how do souls or immaterial entities in general relate to space, or specifically in the case of souls, how they relate to bodies. And To provide an example or an illustration of this, Moore uses the image of light. He says if we want to imagine this, we should imagine it based on the image of light. And so if, for example, we imagine a candle lit in the dark room, there will be a sphere illuminated by the candle, and beyond this sphere, the room will be in the dark. And we can say that light, about the way how light relates to the space that it illuminates, that it is a whole in the whole of the space that it illuminates, but it is also wholly present in each of its parts. We can't really speak about specific bits of light being in specific bits of space. So the way light is present in space is different to that, and it doesn't really have any spatial parts, and it cannot be really divided. So it is wholly in the whole of the illuminated space and wholly in each of its parts. Moore then goes on and provides a distinction between the center from where the light comes. In this example, that would be the flame of the candle, and the rays that emanate or shine from it and fill the illuminated space. And this is a distinction that is very important for Moore. And he describes the center as basically a point where all the power or all the potential of the light is concentrated, focused. And again, he uses an image or metaphor of a different metaphor related to light, where he says it is like when we focus solar rays with a magnifying glass, and we use the magnifying glass to focus the solar rays into a single point, which can then, ignite a piece of paper or something. So in the same way, in the center, all the power of the light is sort of focused and concentrated, and rays represent a passage into act of this power. And being this passage into act, the rays themselves do not have any power to sort of shine further. This is how Moore explains, because otherwise light would always be infinite. Because if the rays had the power to keep on shining in the same way as the center from where they came does, at the end of the illuminated sphere, these rays would continue to shine, and they would create another sphere, and at the end of that sphere, they would create another sphere, and so on and so on, and the light would expand indefinitely into space, or infinitely into space. So the rays are the passage into act, but they do not have the power to shine anymore themselves. In relation to soul, Moore uses as an example of this character, or of this difference between the center and the rays. In the case of the soul, Moore again presents an example or a story where he describes a countryman that finds in the winter, a countryman finds a snake in the snow, and the snake seems to be dead. And the countryman takes this snake and brings it home, puts it close to the fire. And with the warmth of the fire, the body of the snake warms up, and the snake wakes up again and comes back to life. And in technical terms, when Moore explains this, he says, well, in the cold, the soul of the snake retracted into the center. So just as the magnifying glass that focuses the solar rays into the center, so it's sort of, in order to survive, it gathered all of its strength into the center, and therefore it retracted from the body, and the body looked dead. But in the warmth of the fire, the soul again started shining and expanding, and the rays filled or permeated, spread through the body again, and therefore the snake came back to life. So this is briefly put the image of light and this metaphor of light as an image for the spatiality of the soul or for the soul's relation to space in More's early works, and where he subscribes to the theory that he will later call Hollenmerism, where souls are present in space just as light is present in space, and that is wholly in the whole of the space where it is present and wholly in each of the parts where it is present. Now, if we go on to More's later philosophy, Hollenmerism is an opinion that he rejects because he now feels that it leads to a lot of logical contradictions and impossibilities. We might, for example, look at the Divine Dialogues, which you can see in the slide, where the character Hilobares says, and that the spirit of man, which we usually call his soul, is wholly without flitting in his toe and wholly in his head at once. If the whole soul be in the toe, there is nothing left to be in the head. Therefore, the notion of a spirit is perfectly impossible, and so on and so on. And of course, this is a dialogue, so Hilobares is a spokesperson for materialism. So the inconsistencies of Hollenmerism lead him to the conclusion that the notion of a spirit or of a soul is impossible and that souls do not exist. But Philotheus, who is the spokesman for More, that he only disagrees with the conclusion. So he agrees with Hilobares' argument, but he just says, well, but this only refutes the Hollenmerian conception of a soul, which is wrong. But if we have if we come up with the correct notion of a soul, we will see that it exists, and so on and so on. So although he doesn't agree with the conclusion of Hilobares, he agrees with the argument. So the argument that Hollenmerism leads to contradictions, because if the soul cannot be the whole of it in the toe and the whole of it in the head at the same time, for example. And in other works, More presents other similar arguments. And in his later philosophy, More's response to this is that he basically says that souls are extended in space in the same way as bodies are. So they are really fully spatially extended. And that includes also the fact that they have different spatial parts, that is, partes, extra partes. And the only difference in regards to space between souls or immaterial entities and bodies is that the spatial parts that the souls have are not divisible. They cannot be separated one from the other. More here uses the term indiscernible, but that's just his technical term where he differentiates between indivisible, which means logical indivisibility, basically an absence of parts, and indiscernibility, which means actual indivisibility. That is what is the case with souls, that they do have spatial parts, but these cannot be divided, separated one from the other. But when he needs to provide an example or a picture or something to help the reader imagine how these indiscernible spatial parts of the souls are to be conceived, he again uses the same image, the same metaphor of light. And the only thing that changes is that he very quickly switches to a much more technical vocabulary. So he doesn't speak about center and rays anymore, but he speaks about primary and secondary substance. But the image behind it is really the same. So the primary substance represents the eye of the soul, and the secondary substance is an emanative effect. So it's something that emanates from the primary substance without the need of any other external cause to contribute to it. So it emanates sort of, we might say, automatically from the primary substance. And the fact that it is such an emanative effect of the primary substance means that the secondary substance cannot be separated from the primary substance, and that they together they form one and the same soul. Although the primary substance is really the center, and the secondary substance, again similar to the rays in its early philosophy, is what fills what emanates from this primary substance and fills the space occupied by the soul or by light. Again, to describe this relation of indiscernibility between the primary and secondary substance, More uses again refers to light, as we can see here again from the quotation in the slide. But the parts of a spirit can be no more separated, though they be dilated. Then you can cut off the rays of the sun by a pair of scissors made of the lucid crystal. So again, the secondary substance cannot be separated from the primary substance, just as the rays of the sun cannot be cut off of the sun from where they are coming. I'm not sure how much time do I have left. Do I have 5 minutes maybe, or?
Yes, you have still 5 minutes at least. Yeah.
Okay, great, and thank you very much. So, and more than even develops this idea of spheres and of orbs, and presents an image where basically each of the 5 senses forms such an orb around the primary substance of the soul. And and it basically really corresponds even to the, because it seems that furthermore the primary substance of the soul is located in the brain. So the concentric orbs that correspond to the senses basically correspond to the distance of each of the sensory organs from the brain. So there's the orb of sight, then there's the orb of hearing, the orb of smell, the orb of taste, and finally the orb of touch that encompasses the whole body. Now, just very quickly, I will touch on the second point, because it is, I think it is interesting, but it is what I mentioned in the beginning, that More doesn't have any metaphysics of light as, for example, Ficino or Patrizi do. And here I will really touch on this subject very briefly, but if it interests you, I refer you to the article by Andreas Blank on Henry More on spirit, flight, and immaterial extension, where he speaks about it into more detail. But it is a very interesting contrast, because More, especially in his later works, he defends a Cartesian theory of light, which means that for More, light is a stream of material particles. And in More's pretty much dualistic scheme, where there are bodies and souls as distinct substances, it means that basically light is, in principle, on a metaphysical level, has no more in common with the soul than any other material object does. But still, light is used as an example, as an image, as a metaphor for explaining how souls relate to space. And what is another very interesting thing in this regard is that when More presents this image of light, he doesn't really, he explicitly says that he explicitly likens the soul to the Aristotelian notion of light and intentional species, as again you can see in the quote in the slide. So it seems that he is aware of the fact that there is the Aristotelian theory of light, which he considers to be false, but he also seems to consider it to be a good image to imagine how souls relate to space. And then there is the sort of correct theory of light, which is the Cartesian theory of light as a stream of material particles. But this light as it really is doesn't really have anything in common with the soul. And now to proceed to my conclusion, what I think that we can sort of learn from this or conclude from this is that really all, even in his early works and even in his late works, More uses the same image of light, and he uses it in a very similar manner to describe how souls relate to space. And because if we look at more the scholarly literature, secondary literature on More, when it discusses this topic, it always focuses strictly on the philosophical theories that More defended, and then the interpretations of how to relate More's early Holland-Merism to his later theory differ. You have people like Jasper Reed who believes that we really should keep the two very strictly separate, or you have people like David Leach who try to find some similarity and continuity between the two theories. But this scholarly literature in general always focuses on the philosophical theories as if they were really both the starting point and the final point of More's thinking about the subject. And what I would like to suggest, and what I tried to argue in my paper, is that maybe it might be more instructive to focus on this image of light, and that maybe what was the starting point for More was really this intuition, this image that souls are present in space in a way similar to how light is present in space, and that the philosophical theories only sort of came afterwards as an attempt to give some theoretical philosophical backing to that, so that he tried to sort of explain this intuition of his through Holland-Merism at first, and then when he grew dissatisfied with it, he developed his own theory of spiritual extension. But these were only sort of attempts to encapsulate or philosophically or to philosophically describe the leading intuition that stayed the same throughout, and that is, as I said, that souls are present in space in a way that is similar to how light is present in space. And that is all from me, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jacques, for your talk. And a discussion on the paper will, as Vladimir said, will follow after the second paper. Our second speaker today is Dagmar Pichová, who is an associate professor at the Department of Philosophy, Masaryk University in Brno, Czech Republic. She earned her PhD at Masaryk University and Université Paris 12, doctorat en co-titel, in 2006. In her scientific and research activities, she focuses on the history of women philosophers and 18th century French philosophy and literature. She is author of several studies and monographs, for example, to name just a few, Émilie du Châtelet, Femme de Lettres, published in Prague in 2018, or 100 myšlenkových experimentů ve filozofii, 100 Thought Experiments in Philosophy, published in Prague in 2013, and co-authored with Marek Picha. Dagmar, floor is yours.
Thank you. I will start by sharing the screen. Okay, so thank you again for your invitation and for the possibility to present my paper during this workshop, though I really hope that we will all meet in person in September and we will follow the discussion offline as well. I think I will present the structure of my presentation. shortly after the introduction, I will analyze aesthetic elements in the conversations. Then I will focus on epistemic goals in the conversations. And I will analyze as well the use of thought experiments in Fontenelle's conversations. I really tried to cut my presentation, but of course, if necessary, I will continue the cutting and I will be strict about that. So I will start with a short introduction. In his Conversations on the Plurality of Words, Bernard Lebovier de Fontenelle introduces one of the first projects of the popularization of science. Fontenelle describes the Cartesian theory of the universe and develops as well his ideas on the possible inhabitants of other worlds. In the editions that followed the first publication, Fontenelle did not always adjust the text according to the most recent astronomical discoveries. It was rather the general heliocentric perspective, still not universally accepted by the society, that he aimed to propose. The conversations reflected the general strategy adopted by Académie Royale des Sciences, presided over by Fontenelle since 1697, to expand the public of their work and diffuse the knowledge in France. The conversations were published only 1 year before the Cartesian theory was refuted by the gravitation theory Newton presented in his Principia. However, in the French context, it was the Cartesian theory that remained influential in the first decades of the 18th century, partly because of the national aspect of the rivalry between English Newtonians and French Cartesians. Though he personally admired Newton, and he wrote as well L'Orche devoted to Newton, Fontenelle remained the partisan of Cartesian theory until his death. Using the notion popularization of science in the case of conversation, I must clarify the notion of public. So who were the intended readers of the text? Fontenelle aims to address typically the members of salons in Paris. That was a mixed society composed both by the learned, savants, and socialites, gens du monde. As he notes in the preface to the Conversations, his goal is to present philosophy in a way that is, I quote, "It's neither to drive for men and women of the world, nor too playful for scholars," unquote. That is why he combines scientific discourse and the rhetoric of galanterie. The galanterie was based on the playful communication between men and women using various forms of verbal seduction. In the 17th century, the art of conversation becomes central to achieve success in French high society. The Cartesian explanation of the universe by Fontenelle is presented both in the scientific and aesthetic terms, in the search of savoir and plaisir. In Fontenelle's tour of the universe in the Conversation, the reader finds the knowledge of Cartesian theory and pleasure expressed, among others, by a rich metaphorical imagery. In his description of the universe, Descartes himself was using images. That's why the metaphorical imagery that worked well for the popularization of Cartesian theory. And it was different than the attempts to make popularization attempts of Newton's theory, where the use of images was felt as artificial and overall clumsy. Fontenelle borrows metaphorical expressions from Descartes, and other authors as well, but he develops his own metaphors and develops traditional metaphors in a new specific way. In the presentation, I will focus on Fontenelle's use of metaphors in relation to aesthetic and epistemic goals. I will describe their specificity and role in the dramaturgy of the work. So let's have a look at the first part, aesthetic elements. The first category stems from the rhetoric of Galanterie and refers to aesthetic evaluation of the universe. In the conversation between the philosopher and the marquise, the metaphors participate in the discourse of seduction, as expressed in the first scene of the conversation. The journey through the universe starts one evening in the Chateau Park, where the two protagonists begin to discuss the starry night. In the introductory scene in a park, it is the beautiful night that triggers the contemplation. The philosopher starts by linking the description of a world with metaphorical gallant compliments addressed to his partner in discussion. The presentation of the universe continues with the imaginary excursion to the moon. The philosopher explains the theory of colors in relation to the perception on the moon. In contrast with the explanation of the philosopher, the marquise intervenes by questioning the harmony of lunar colors and compares them to the colors on Earth. But the philosopher reacts by reminding her of the natural sense of harmony and beauty. And I give you the quote. After the character of colors on various planets is explained according to the scientific explorations, the philosopher continues by combining the scientific data with the expressions of Galanterie. The universe is presented as a coherent economic system based on harmonious elements that can be appreciated as forms of beauty. The aesthetic requirements by the marquise are referred to the harmony inherent in nature. In the third evening, the philosopher talks about sources of comparison between nature and female beauty. The analogy between feminine beauty and natural elements refers to the universal harmony. The conversations contain several references to the image of woman on the moon. The metaphor of a woman's face used in the description of natural elements is reflected as well in the reference to the real-life map by the moon by Giovanni Domenico Cassini, the Italian astronomer who was the director of the Royal Observatory in Paris since 1671. In the conversation, the philosopher mentions explicitly the Cassini lunar map, where it is possible to find the image of a beautiful woman. And the marquise reacts to his description and to the description of the possible atrocities made to the face of the beautiful woman on the moon. The philosopher affirms that the observers of the universe are inclined to describe its elements in aesthetic terms. Not only the nature is described as a reservoir of beauty and harmony, it is also the human perspective that exploits imagination and seeks to find beautiful traits in the various attitudes to nature, the scientific examination of the universe included. And I skip because I have to go more quickly. The metaphors used in the context of Galanterie we've just seen could be viewed as preparatory for the marquise and for the reader as well to consider the metaphors developed in the description of cosmological and philosophical theories and thought experiments. In the introduction to the conversation, the philosopher explains his project and the use of imagination in the proposed journey of the universe. He's linking the aesthetic and cognitive goals. And I give you the first quote where he talks about the imagination and the effort of ladies and the reader in general. The understanding of the metaphors related to the aesthetic elements can be transferred to the comprehension of metaphors developing scientific ideas. In the conversations, the philosopher explains to the Marquis the similarities between the logic of mathematics and love. Scientific metaphors reflect the use and strategies of gallant metaphors. In his description of the universe, Fontenelle, as I've already said, uses some metaphors developed by Descartes and his partisans. Fontenelle uses metaphorical language to replace some specific scientific expressions already in use by his contemporaries. For example, he is using the expressions équipage céleste and coque de verre à soie instead of scientific terms planète secondaire and masse élémentaire. They were already perfectly in use. The structure of the conversation is based on the metaphor of voyage du monde. The journey becomes a metaphor of the search of knowledge. After the presentation of conflicted theories related to the Earth, the philosopher persuades the Marquis to accept the heliocentric theory and reconsider her usual attitudes. The philosopher invites the Marquis and the readers to take the risk, to be brave. The change is described both as a pleasant and courageous adventure. In the first evening, the Marquis agrees to start the journey and adopts gradually various perspectives. The basic principle of Fontenelle's explanation of the universe consists in the use of analogy and variation, which is also the principle of the creativity of nature. The double procedure is explicitly formulated in the preface, where the author refers to the idea of infinite diversity of the work of nature. The procedure of analogy is reflected in the specific use of metaphors that can be found in the thought experiments in the conversations. So I need basically to specify the relation between metaphor, analogy, and thought experiments. For the purpose of my analysis, I consider analogy as the expression of our perception of similarities between two objects, and metaphors then as a literary device to express the similarity. In both cases, we compare the properties of two objects. Thought experiments, on the other hand, can be defined briefly as complex courses of hypothetical reasoning. Readers are invited to consider hypothetical situations and draw conclusions based on the presented suppositions. The suppositions, the narratives, can be presented in the form of developed metaphors, though there are thought experiments that do not use any figurative language. The experiments presented in the form of metaphors use the reasoning per analogiam, which is the basic mechanism of metaphorical structures. The mechanism is often used in explanatory thought experiments. In the conversations, the experiments in the form of developed metaphors are followed by the explicit explanation of proposed theses. However, Fontenelle uses the experiments not only for didactic purposes to illustrate his theories, but also for epistemic goals. He often presents the experiments as arguments based on the conceivability argument, which states that what can be conceivable is possible. The argument is expressed by the question, why not, pourquoi non, used by the philosopher in his dialogue with the Marquise. However, there are also limits of thought experiments. What does not exist in nature cannot be the object of thought experiments. The philosopher admits the limits to the Marquise and suggests that his method cannot be applied to all phenomena. He admits that the crucial question is not acceptable in some situations. For example, in the example of the sun and the impossibility to put inhabitants there. The principle of analogy cannot be applied in this case, and the hypothesis about the inhabitants of the sun is not possible. The conversations contain many thought experiments. I would say the conversations are one big thought experiment. One of the most famous ones can be found at the beginning of the first evening, where we find this developed metaphor of the flying phaeton in the opera. Fontenelle uses the imagination to describe various approaches to explain the world. He focuses on illustrating the concurrent theories to put forward the only one that actually observe the backstage of the theater. That is obviously the Cartesian mechanistic perspective. The thought experiment again is followed by an explicit reference to the Cartesian theory and its pertinence in reference to other concurrent theories. The thought experiments in the following dialogues between the philosopher and the Marquise serve above all to turn attention to the limits of the anthropocentric perspective. In the fifth evening, the Gardner thought experiment questions the scope of human knowledge and its progress. In the thought experiment, the explicit explanation is placed before the scene, and it follows the description of the progress of knowledge in the history of mankind. The Gardner thought experiment is used as an illustration of the thesis presented by the philosopher. And finally, my conclusion. As we could briefly see in the presentation, the use of metaphors in Fontenelle conversations is systematic and crucial for both the epistemic and aesthetic goals of the work. It starts as constitutive elements of the galanterie between the philosopher and the Marquise. The metaphors are gradually presented to describe the harmonious composition of the universe, as well as the approach of its human observers. The search of beauty of the universe is thus reflective in a real-life object. We had this example of Cassini's map of the moon. The aesthetic use of metaphors is completed by the metaphors applied to seize the constitution of the universe, and as well the theories that try to explain how the universe functions. Based on the principle of analogy and variation that reflects the creativity of nature, the explanation offered by the philosopher invites the Marquise to use her own reasoning and imagination. A specific use then can be observed in the thought experiments. They are used not only to justify Fontenelle's position, but, and that's crucial in the conversations, to provide a methodological training for the readers, testing the limits of the possible in the imagination. The readers are invited to open their mind to the new conception of the universe. At the end of the conversation, it's really the final paragraph, the philosopher describes the génie that enables the readers to transgress the dry speculations of science and be successful also in the domain of pleasure. In his final talk to the Marquise, the philosopher invites her to follow this spirit and hold the unity of savoir and plaisir. The sixth evening thus closes by linking the domain of science and sociability. According to Fontenelle, the two spheres should not be approached as separate. Moreover, their connection is seen as a big advantage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for for your presentation, for your talk. Thank you both for your presentations. I'm sorry that I before the talks I did not mention or did not introduce your papers by their titles. Sorry for this omission, but I hope that did not negatively influenced the reception of your papers and of your thoughts on Henry Moore and Bernard de Fontenelle. So now I'm opening the discussion, and please, if you have a comment or question, just raise your hand physically, or you can use chat for writing, or of course you can use the button reactions, which is down in the Zoom at the right side. And I see two participants who raised their hands, and I think Lucie Štorchová was the first one. So please, Lucie.
Yeah, so many thanks again to both speakers. Both papers were really fascinating, and I would like to have one question to Dagmar. Well, so I really appreciated your point about the galanterie discourse in behind the whole argument, and I would like to ask about two things. So the first one is whether you can see some sort of gender-specific language, let's say. So when they have a conversation, when they discuss some topics, the Marquise and the philosopher, whether their rhetoric is different. So the first one is like, let's say, a female one on the level of rhetorical tools, or a vocabulary and so on. And the second one is gendered in some other way. So this is my question. I suppose this will be the case. And I would like to know how both voices differ, let's say. And my second point, especially in this period, as far as I know, gender often intersects with some others discourses of social difference, let's say. So I would be interested whether there are also some references to their social status, you know, so whether these languages differ or some from point of view of their social status. So he is a scholar and she is a Marquise, so somebody in a completely different social position, let's say, and whether this thing somehow created also their speech or their discourse as such. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for your question. That's really interesting. I haven't really thought when I was analyzing the conversations about the differences that you spoke. I think it's mostly because I would say they use the same codes because they are both members of Gens du Monde, of the socialists. So I would say the Galant code of their language is the same. So I haven't really noticed any difference in their language, or the voices seem to me like be the same voices of the Society of Salons. Yes, but that's it's a philosopher. Let's say the role of the philosopher in the conversation is the role of a philosopher in a salon, so someone who knows the code and uses the code when he talks with a marquise from high society. So I would say it's the same code they do use because they are part of the same society. Mm-hmm. So is it? But thank you very much. It's a really interesting to see in this perspective. I have always analyzed it as the same voices. Yeah, and I haven't asked myself why they have these same voices.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I see another question or comment by Richard Bloom. Richard, please.
Yeah, I have a question for each of the two of you. Maybe I start with Jacques-Joseph. Do I understand correctly that Henry Moore fell prey to his own metaphor of light for soul, so that he had to adapt the physics of light to the purpose of the metaphor in explaining the soul? That would be my question to Jacques-Joseph. And my question to Dagmar Pichova, do I understand correctly that the flirtatious dialogue itself is a metaphor for the scientific investigation, for the philosophical research, so that my question then would be, and that would follow up to the previous question, so that I would ask, so what is the analog in philosophy or in science to the flirtation in that kind of dialogue?
Shall I begin?
Yes.
So yeah, thank you for this question. I'm not sure if I would really use the term that Henry Moore falls prey to his own metaphor, but I really think that he sticks to this metaphor very very faithfully all throughout his career, and it is true that it's in his later philosophy, it puts him into a bit of a difficult spot between the Aristotelian theory of light that he has to use in his metaphor for it to work, and the material Cartesian theory of light that he defends as true in physics. So there is definitely this tension, and which is a consequence of him sticking to this metaphor. But I'm not sure if I'd say that he falls prey to it. But
yes, and the second question was to Dagmar Pichova.
Yes, thank you. So, well, if I look at the conversations, I would see it more as a metaphor of accepting a new scientific theory, right? So how we approach a new scientific theory, not so much as a metaphor of a scientific investigation, because there's this difference between the scientist or the philosopher and his public. So I think I would hold in this metaphorical description the difference between a scientific research or a philosopher and his public. Yes, and about the scientific investigation. I'm thinking if any part of the conversations really reflects the scientific investigations, a scientific investigation. I think some of the thought experiments inside of the conversations certainly do. Yeah, I think which ones I mentioned? Well, even the flying phaeton and the Gardner thought experiments. Really, the experiments that have epistemic goals and are used as arguments. They would be this kind of metaphors of scientific investigations, developed metaphors. Am I answering correctly your answer? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I see Vladimír Urbánek.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jacques and Dagmar, for your papers. Very, very interesting and extremely inspiring. I have a couple of questions for Dagmar and one question for Jacques, which are related to broader contexts. And first, my question, or a couple of questions to Dagmar. You mention in the written version of your paper, you mention exactly the broader context, sort of general strategy adopted by Académie Royale des Sciences regarding the popularization of science in this period. And my question is, was this strategy really conscious or articulated in the documents of the Academy at this time, or can we rather consider it to be a sort of shared practice, not a strategy, but practice, which and this could be influenced, of course, also by commercial interests, for example, of the publishers, and by the interest of broader circles of readers, etc. And what is the role of metaphors in this broader discourse of which you call vulgarization of sciences? This is one question. Then there is a question related to this rivalry between the Cartesians and Newtonians, which you mentioned as a broader context for this kind of genre and literature, etc. And my question is whether Fontenelle used, despite his sympathy for Newton, whether he used similar practices of popularization in his criticism of, or in the broader criticism of Newton, whether it was used in the context of this popularization discourse, or whether it was just a part of scientific, more narrow discourse. And my third question relates to you pointed out to the fact that Fontenelle borrows some metaphorical expressions directly from Descartes and also from other authors, perhaps. And I believe this is important. And would you go that far to claim that Fontenelle was a part of the specific Cartesian metaphorical discourse? And just I'm curious, who were the other authors that Fontenelle used in this relation? So that's my questions to Dagmar. And my question to Jacques. Again, in the written version of your paper, you mention at some point the broader context in which we should read Henry Moore's discussion of the light and his usage of light as a metaphor for soul and spatiality of the soul. And this is the campaign against atheism. And I'm just curious whether Moore used the same imagery that he used in the natural philosophical context in some of his more theological works and even in his apocalyptic writings. So this is my question to Jacques. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I start. Thank you very much, but it's many questions, and I'm not sure if I'm able to answer them properly, but I will certainly address them in my article, because of course I will be working on the text, and I will try to enrich the text for the presentation in September. So I will go more in detail during the presentation in September. So now only briefly about the first question, and I hope I've got everything correctly, about the strategy of Académie Royale des Sciences. Well, I think this was a part of a big turn and change in the strategy, because when Fontenelle became the secretary of the Academy in 1697, he replaced his predecessor in the function named Duhamel, who wrote the history of the Academy in Latin. So only the change that Fontenelle, as the secretary of the Academy, started to write the history of the Academy in French was already a big gesture of popularization and change in strategy. So this strategy of Academy to broaden the public of their discussions was evident. Yes, so this is one of the gestures of the changes I can mention right now. Then when I briefly address the second question, the criticism of Newton. Well, it's quite complicated in the case of Fontenelle, because he, I think I mentioned that in my presentation, he even wrote eloge for Newton. So he admired him a lot in many ways. Only he somehow remained a Cartesian till his death, because he couldn't accept the gravitation theory, because he saw there the power of invisible forces, and that was something that was not acceptable for him. He remained a Cartesian mechanist till the end of his days. And I would say he didn't really use a broader criticism of Newton. It remained really on the level of the criticism of gravitation theory. So if I answered correctly to your question, yes.
And there was related question whether this topic, this very topic, appeared also in these writings in French addressed to the broader audience. Whether the polemic, be it Fontenelle or other French authors, with Newton created a specific discourse in these genres addressed to the broader public, and whether my question is directed to the topic of using metaphors in polemic with Newton.
Okay. Well, I'm not really sure about that. For that, I think I will have to think it through, because that's a very specific, too specific for me to reply properly. So I can't really tell the difference in the way Fontenelle criticized Newton and the use of metaphors in this criticism. Yes. And if I may, the Cartesian discourse and the use of Cartesian metaphors, he was using the metaphors he found in the works of other Cartesians in French publications, or in the physics by Roux, for example. But as I said, his presentation of the cosmology is Cartesian in the conversations, but there aren't actually so many Cartesian metaphors. It's usually presented in this way, but when we read closely the text, I would say he uses more his own metaphors and images in the thought experiments than really referring to specific Cartesian metaphors. So, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And Jacques-Joseph and his answer?
The question was whether More uses the same imagery of light also in his theological and apocalyptic writings. Well, as for the apocalyptic writings, I have to admit that I don't know, because I haven't read them. But concerning the theological writings, as far as I can remember, well, one thing is that the subject of the spatiality of the soul, of the soul's relation to space, is not really something that comes up in his theological writing. So he doesn't really need to use the image of light in this in the same way. But as far as I can remember, I don't think I remember him using light as a metaphor for the soul in the theological writings, but much more often it was light as a metaphor for reason in his theological writings. It was especially in his arguments against enthusiasts. He defends that that faith has to always concord with reason. And for example, I remember a passage where he says that the enthusiasts who basically forsake reason to just listen to what they believe is the voice of God, but is in fact only the voice of their own melancholy. He uses the image where he says that these enthusiasts are like people that go out into the night with a lantern and decide to snuff out the lantern and continue in the dark. And in other places, he uses similar images, and light, time and again, as far as I can remember, comes up much more often as an image or as a metaphor for reason in the theological contexts. And as I'm saying, for the apocalyptic ones, I really don't know. I didn't get yet to read those writings.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there is no question or comment at the moment, I have one comment which came to my mind. There is a link between your papers, because I think that the thought experiments which were described by Dagmar in the work of or in the metaphorics of Fontenelle is somehow or can be somehow identified with what Henry More does with soul, because I think that the soul as a light, it is not only a metaphor, but a kind of thought experiment, although not scientific perhaps metaphysical or something philosophical. But it's a thought experiment how to imagine soul in the world of materia, in the world of matter, or in the world after Descartes. And I have a question maybe to Jacques. Is there a possibility or a possibility to explain the problem with the double conception of light in Late-Moore? That means light as a material particle, or as material particles which mechanically somehow move in the res extensa, or in the space. This is, if I understood well, this is one explanation of light in Moore, and the second one is not explanation, but it is the metaphor or thought experiment of soul as a light. And I'm not expert in physics or in philosophy of physics, but I think that in the current physics there are also two incompatible ways how to conceive light, or how to conceptualize light. There are two theories: the wave theory and the particle theory. And I'm not sure, but I think they are not compatible either. So perhaps can this metaphor of, or thought experiment of soul as a light in Moore, can it be somehow conceived as a model which is just an alternative to the material mechanistic explanation of light in physics? Or how could Moore is it imaginable for Moore to have two models of light, which one is spiritual, I would say, and one is mechanical?
Thank you for this, for the comment about the possible connection between our papers, because it gives me an inspiration on how maybe to think about it, to think about my subject from a different perspective. But to your question, well, I think there's a couple of things there, and without going into contemporary physics, because I don't really understand them, but one thing is that I'm not sure that Moore really needs to have two different theories of light in parallel, because in the comparison with the soul, he uses light as an image, as a metaphor, or as a thought experiment on how to imagine this. So he doesn't need, strictly speaking, light to really be this way. He only needs people to have this conception of light. And then he goes on to say, okay, so now imagine this, and this is how souls work, in fact. So he doesn't really, that would be one thing. The other thing would be, I think, that, while I wouldn't really say that Moore's later philosophy is really as strictly dualistic as Descartes', for example, he still draws a very, very strict line between what is material and what is immaterial, spiritual entities like souls and so on. And I think this difference for him is strict enough that light really couldn't be both at the same time, because immaterial entities are indivisible, but they are also penetrable, and they are also active, whereas material entities or bodies are passive and passive and divisible and impenetrable. And it wouldn't really, I don't think it would really work in the same way as in modern physics, where we can say that we can have a wave matter, wave particle duality of light. But so I'm not really sure if it would hold in Moore's case. If that answers, I'm not sure if that answered your question or. Yeah,
of course. Thank you. But it seems to me that when it is so omnipresent in Moore's treatments, this metaphor of light or of soul as a light or as the light, it seems to me that it is something crucial. So why would he, even in the later works, again and again repeat, if it would be just an illustration or a metaphor? I mean, a metaphor in the meaning of image in imagination, because I don't understand how Moore can explain the soul only by the primary and secondary substance discourse. I mean, it is in fact scholastic discourse or Aristotelian scholastic discourse. But he again, it seems to me that he again goes back to the metaphorical language of light in the case of metaphysics of the soul. So I don't know. It seems to me that he considers it to be more than just I don't know, just the phantasma or just the. It's an explanatory instrument. I think it is visible from your text and from what you found out. But I don't know. Why would
no? I mean, I agree with you in that it seems strange that it would really be nothing more than just an illustrative example for Moore. But I think what Andreas Blank's article points out is basically that if we want to interpret Moore as a philosopher who's consistent with himself in his later period, we basically the only way to solve this is to say that the image of light is really just an illustrative example for him in the case of the soul. And I think I agree. I agree with this conclusion to the extent that, as I said, we can't really have a sort of an escape clause like the wave-particle duality in contemporary physics. But of course, that doesn't mean that. Well, we still have the other option, which is to say, well, there is a little inconsistency in Moore's thought, because he really seems to be fascinated by this link between the soul and the light, and it seems that there is more to it than just an illustrative example. But then, if we take up the Enchiridion Metaphysicum, the passage where he says that light is just a stream of particles is inconsistent with this, and you know, maybe because and this is another thing when I said, well, that Moore doesn't really have a metaphysics of light, is that there aren't really any, as opposed to, again, Renaissance Platonists or so on, there aren't really any passages in Moore where he would really go, where he would really provide a deep and detailed discussion into the metaphysical and physical nature of light. So there are either the passages where he speaks about the soul and he brings up light as this image or metaphor for the soul's presence in space. And then there is one chapter in the Enchiridion Metaphysicum, which is basically his compendium of natural philosophy. There is one chapter where he describes what light is and how it works, and he basically just rehashes Cartesianism without really adding anything to it, and so it doesn't really. From the way he treats light in the Enchiridion Metaphysicum, it seems that light itself, as it isn't really an important subject for him. So he doesn't really provide a deeper theory, and so which also means that maybe this is what, if someone brought up this inconsistency to him, maybe that this Cartesian theory of light would be what he actually decides to let go, but I don't know. Now we're really speculating, so that's. What I'm trying to say is. Yes, that he doesn't really pay much attention to light as it is itself, and he pays much more attention to descriptions of how souls relate to space, and only brings up light as an image to illustrate this.
Okay, thank you very much. And other questions and comments are there? So I don't see any other questions and comments. So I'm handing over to Vladimir for finishing our today's seminar. Thank you to all.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I would like also thank to both speakers, today's speakers, for the excellent papers. I would like to thank to all participants of this meeting, and I would like to invite you, of course, to join us for the last of our seminars next week, the 3rd of June. We will have 2 papers again. Tomáš Havelka from the Institute of Philosophy will speak about metaphorical level of Comenius's Labyrinth of the World and Paradise of the Heart. And Anna Červínská-Hörig from the University of Vechta will address a topic called Explaining the Meaning of the Inexpressible, Pietist Metaphors Concerning the Phenomenon of the Renewal. So you are most welcome to join us, and see you next week. Thank you very much once again.